Hi. So today I have a very special guest, Dr. MaryAndres, who is I think of as the Yoda of bisexual affirmative therapy. Thank you so much for being here today.
Sure.
So today we're going to be talking about something kind of complex for some people, which is how do you know that you're bisexual? And certainly for some people, for myself, I figured it out rather quickly because I was having attractions at a young age, but that's not the case for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
For many people, the situations come out later in life. Mm-hmm. And also there was a CDC study, I've done a video about this, a CDC study where the number of bisexuals went up, and they looked at the study and figured out why that was, and it was because when people are asked first about their behavior or their attraction and then asked their identity,
Mm-hmm.
They're more likely to identify as bisexual. So with all those people, those mostly straight people, how are they to know if they are bisexual?
Yeah, great question, and I'm really glad you brought up that study. I think what the study points out most of all is the stigma about bisexuality, and that when you ask somebody a label and do you fit this box, people just go no, 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 so there's still this kind of biphobia related to that term. But when you ask people what their behaviors and their attractions are, you see much more fluidity. And you see people kind of claiming that and then kind of drawing this, oh, if this is what that means, they go right into that. But nobody wants the boxes. That's part of what we're recognizing most of all. There's two studies, that I think are relevant related to this. The Kinsey scale, which a lot of people know, the 0 to 6. Mm-hmm. And so we look at very few people actually just sit right there on that 3 because nobody stays in boxes very well. But you could potentially say anybody from a 2 to a 5 is somewhere along a bi spectrum.
Right.
And I know lots of people will say, oh, I'm a Kinsey 6 all the time, or heterosexuals that'll just say, oh, I'm definitely completely 100% heterosexual. But what that spectrum is looking at is it's looking at what your attractions are like, what your fantasies are like, what some of your behaviors might be like. And that's where when you start adding in those variances, you start to see people with that more kind of fluid or bi identity.
So for those people who are on the outskirts of the spectrum, let's say there are 2 or there are 5.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, even though I knew, and it's a tough topic, because even though I knew I was bisexual at 17, I kind of said, you know what, I must be bisexual. I went through many years where I was like, well, maybe I'm no longer bisexual. I'm now attracted to this woman, so maybe I'm now straight. Or, oh my goodness, I find attracted to this guy, I'm now gay. So really, is it the feelings? Is it the behavior? Like, what exactly is it?
That's great. So we talked about there's identity, feelings, and behavior. And identity is what I claim for myself. Do I claim, we can claim, I can claim I'm heterosexual, I can claim I'm bi, or I can claim I'm gay. And that's basically a label that I'm putting on myself. Then what I'm doing might be completely different. We see people that might identify as hetero, but they're out, having sex, same-sex experiences. Right. And that their identity isn't something they're claiming, in an authentic way related to their behavior. So I'm losing this track of your question though, but I want that, so that identity is the label piece.
Yes.
Then the feelings, and so I want to go back to the Kinsey 2. Okay. So a Kinsey 2 would be somebody who predominantly identifies as heterosexual, and yet what their behavior is predominantly is opposite sex, but their fantasy life might be towards the same gender. And so what happens is it might be that you're having sex as a male with your wife, but you have to think about that hot guy from the movie you just watched to get off. That might be what a Kinsey 2 looks like for someone. Okay. Let's say you move up, or a 1 or a 2, well, that might be a Kinsey 1. The Kinsey 2 is like you occasionally engage in some kind of play, so maybe you're having some kind of sexual contact with men occasionally, but you're very much keeping that secret and very much kind of holding on to this mostly straight identity.
Well, let me give you a couple of examples. Yeah. So I have had to male best friends through my life,
Yeah.
and one of them said, we're talking about bisexuality, and he said, I've had feelings, but I didn't do anything about it, so so I'm not bisexual. And another one said, when I was in high school, I saw a guy I was attracted to, but they weren't in the same clubs I was in. They were different. I had to make an effort to go over there and make something happen with them. So no, I didn't do it. So no, I'm not bisexual either.
Okay.
Where is that line? Because and this is just my personal opinion, but I believe that like on the spectrums, on the outskirts, there's a level of choice going on there. Because when you're married, you can choose to nurture feelings for other people, and you can choose not to.
Right.
You can choose to act on your feelings. You can choose not to act on your feelings, and Lord knows people choose to identify how they choose to identify.
Right.
So is it somewhat, for some people, obviously not for me it isn't, and for many people it's not, but for some people is being bisexual a choice?
So bisexual identity or behavior? Because
well, let's go through all of them.
yeah. So what you just described about your two friends, I would say they're potentially bi-curious. So what they're saying is that they're identifying as heterosexual, but they have feelings or they've had attractions towards the same sex. So they haven't necessarily acted on those attractions. They can decide whatever they want to call themselves. There are definitely people who are abstinent or asexual who aren't being sexual anywhere, but they still identify as either straight, gay, or bisexual.
Okay.
Because it's their way of seeing themselves, and that's the most honest way for them to claim who they're attracted to.
Okay.
So then that's one.
Identity.
The identity, and then the behavior could be that there's somebody who is engaging in a lot of sex with either same or opposite sex people or both, and yet they're not claiming any identity, and that could be their homophobia or their biphobia. That they're saying no, I'm straight, but they're closeted in a way because their behavior doesn't look straight.
Okay.
So they're not going to own that bi label or that bi identity, but their behavior is definitely looking that way. And we don't impose this necessarily. I mean, you can impose it. I don't know what value it does for you. I think the whole point of you doing this series is to help bi people be more real and more authentic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And also, and personally, once again,
Yeah.
I feel like for some, bisexuality is a choice. Not because, before anyone gets up in arms, not because, not so other people can run away from the bisexual label, but I feel like, I remember once, I'd done a video a couple years ago about being bisexual, and someone wrote me on the comment section saying how they were distressed, very distressed, and leading to very negative behavior because they had felt a same-sex attraction to a wrestler on television. And because of this, they were saying hateful things towards other bisexuals. And I spoke to him about it, and I kind of explained to him that, because you have you're drawn to a particular person of the same sex, it doesn't mean anything. It could psychologically just be something. This could be a father figure for you. And you could be then interpreting it in other ways. There's so many things about it that could be the case that does not mean you're gay, does not mean you're bisexual. And it seemed to have relieved some of his stress and then allowed him not to be so judgmental to himself, not to be so angry
And reactive,
which allowed him to perhaps come into his bisexuality in his own way at his own time. So, I personally feel that if you say that, not for everybody, but certainly for some people, it's a matter of choice, it relieves the pressure of having to identify, and hence allows you to come to it in your own terms.
Yeah, I bet you've gotten a lot of pushback on that choice word. But let me just go into, there are always choices, but choices are related to expression. There's choice in terms of, am I choosing to be real with who I am? So that's one choice. Do I...
choice of authenticity.
Yes, the choice of authenticity. And so you could have a public identity or a private identity. You're making a choice about that, about how out somebody might want to be. Then you have your choices about feelings and behaviors. Now, feelings sounds suspicious because we think feelings just happen to us. But we do have feelings, and then we feed our feelings, or we repress our feelings, you know. And so let me say, like, for example, if you're in a relationship and you have deemed it to be a monogamous relationship, and this happens for everyone in relationships, you might have feelings for somebody outside of your relationship, and then you can engage a lot in flirting behavior, and you're feeding those feelings. You're letting that infatuation grow. Or you can say, uh-oh, warning, danger, this could really complicate my committed monogamous relationship.
Yes.
So you choose to starve those feelings, in a sense, as opposed to feeding them. And then what you do is you feed the primary relationship. And maybe what you do is you bring into that primary relationship, if you have a comfortable, authentic relationship, man, I really got triggered by, you know, the same-sex person, even though I'm in an opposite-sex relationship or something.
Right.
And maybe that becomes part of this relationship. Or maybe you complicate your relationship even more and say, maybe this monogamy thing's not working for us, you know, and that might be one of those difficult conversations. But that's part of that authenticity too, is that we do this trial and error and try to figure out what's the best fit for our own kind of real selves.
So it's a complicated thing.
Yes.
And who really, for each of us, like as a community, we can identify bisexual and say it is if the capacity to have romantic or sexual attraction to a person of more than one gender. We can say as a community, but as an individual, it's up to each of us to determine what is most authentic to us.
Yeah.
And if it is authentic to us to be bisexual, identify with bisexual, then it's up to us to either nurture it or not nurture it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and one way to nurture a bi identity is to learn more about what does this mean, because I think that there's so many negative messages in our culture, or invisibility, either negative or invisible.
Right.
But when you start to look at who some of the creative geniuses, you know, that are part of the bi community, it gives you this sense of pride. Yeah.
Yes, I you know, in my still bisexual video, I talk about how, you know, I think it was Socrates and Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and Malcolm X and just all these people.
Yeah.
Not David Foster, huge musician producer, who is also
David Bowie.
Well, there's David Bowie. There's that guy. And all these other people, to be a part of that, to be amongst them. And, you know, we did a video about the positives about being bisexual and how being bisexual, how being in that community helps us to be more creative when we embrace it, helps us to kind of self-actualize. So it's a matter of just choosing whether or not we want to be in part of this, and then encouraging if you are, and nurturing if you are.
Right.
Very deep. Very interesting, and I thank you so much for being here. If someone, because you are a bisexual affirmative therapist, if someone wanted to get in contact with you, how would they go about doing that?
Probably email. My name is MaryAndres, ANDRES, @gmail.com.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I do many videos on the bisexual topic, but I don't do them on a regular basis. So if you'd like to see another video, you have to click the little button that says, let me know when a new video comes out. Until the next video, stay cooler, my bisexual friend. Stay cooler. Bye.